It's Tiki Technical Tuesday, and it is a mold making episode. We will be molding this, the Hornbill Jungle Bird. I am very excited about this. It is the Rhinoceros Hornbill version of a mug that I love. We sculpted this in the last episode, and in this episode, we are going to make a plaster mold of that, and then we are going to make a silicone mold of that plaster mold. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, and I'm just going to warn you, we're not going to have time to cover both plaster molds and silicone molds in this episode. We're just gonna stick to the plaster. Let's get back to it. I've got a lot to do today, so expect quite a bit of narration or voiceover while I'm working because I got a lot of work to do. Let's get start with some careful measurements. So what I'm doing here is measuring the sculpture and deciding just how big of a mold I need to have. I want to have a good inch to inch and a half of plaster minimum around the edges of the sculpture, and I'm going to build what I call the mold chair. This mold chair is going to support the sculpture while we are molding it, and it's going to give me some nice square edges to work off of. Once I got the dimensions locked in, it was time to grab some plywood and build the chair. I very carefully used a table saw and a chop saw to cut up all the wood to match the dimensions that I had. And then we went and grabbed my favorite tool. That's right. It is the Craig jig. This is a pocket hole jig that lets you, well, I guess it lets you drill pocket holes. It's an extremely fast way to join flat pieces of wood like this, and the joints are extremely strong, and the best thing about it is you can remove the joints after you put them in, so it's not a permanent way of sticking this wood together. I really want to make sure things are nice and square and tight, so I clamped everything together on my workbench using more of these little Craig tools. No, they do not sponsor me, but these things work fantastically, and I screwed the chair together. Okay, we have got the mold chair done. Now we've got to get the sculpture off of the sculpting platform and onto this mold chair. Before I do that, after I take it off, I'm going to clean up the base of the sculpture, the parts that I couldn't quite get to, and I've got to add the casting sprue. That's going to be the channel that the slip uses to get into the mug for casting. Let's get to it. I plotted out the planned opening on the mug using some tracing paper here, and then I transferred that rough sketch to some table paper, this like craft paper that I use, and that gave me a nice symmetrical guide to mark on the top of the sculpture. Using that guide mark, I then built up a rim of monster clay, and this will slowly evolve into the sprue shape that the slip will use to travel into the mold and cast the mug. Okay, we've got the sprue set up, and it's time to mark our parting lines for the mold. I'm going to put a series of dotted lines on here on the sections on where I want the mold pieces to come together. What am I trying to avoid? Undercuts! If you want to learn more about undercuts, go back and watch my previous mold making episode. I go into depth on it there. Now, I'm thinking that this is going to be a 4-piece mold. 1 piece here, 1 piece here. So those will open like this. And then I'm going to have a small piece here. And then there'll be the 4th piece, which is going to be the bottom. We're not going to worry about the bottom. That'll be the last one we pour. We do need to worry about those first few pieces, though. I'm putting these little dots in as a guide for me to follow when I'm laying up the clay walls of this mold. They're really helpful once the clay starts flying. Okay, that ought to do it. I got the parting lines on. Now it is time to release the living daylights out of this. We're going to put a release agent on it to keep the plaster from sticking to the clay while we make this mold. Monster Clay in the past has recommended that I use Lemon Pledge furniture polish. So I'm going to put on a few coats of that. And then I'm also going to add some coats of mold soap. I'm going to be using, I'm totally blanking here. Let's just pretend I didn't blank, and I'm going to grab the product. Bam! Murphy's Oil Soap. That's what it was. Yeah, I'm going to be using this. I also use another mold soap. It's a much more thicker mold soap when I'm doing the plaster portion, but for this, we're going to use this nice thin stuff. Anyway, there we go. Let's get a bunch of it on here. Applying the lemon pledge and applying the mold soap both kind of work the same way. I put on a coat of it, and then I go back with this soft rag and a soft brush, and I wipe away any excess material, and I buff in and smooth out the remaining material. You just want to build this up in an extremely thin coat. You don't want to block in any details. You don't want to clunk up your mold. You just want to have a nice, even, thin layer of release. I got several coats onto the sculpture. I also wanted to add a few coats onto the mold chair itself. The base of the mold chair is going to be contacting plaster, and I do not want that plaster to stick, so that also got 3 coats of mold soap. Okay, so this is a fantastic example of why you want to set everything up before you start building your clay walls, and especially before you start mixing plaster. I wanted to make sure that my cottle board, which I'm using to make the walls of this mold, were big enough, and spoiler alert, they were not. This one came up just a little short. I wouldn't be able to clamp the edges, so I quickly cut a new one just out of some scrap plywood that fits perfectly in the spot, and I'll be able to clamp this nice and secure. So before I start setting up the walls, I'm going to go ahead and put some fresh new mold soap and release all of these cottle boards. Therefore, once I get the clay walls built, I can slap these on and just pour the plaster in. That's right, it's time for even more mold soap. And believe it or not, this is not the last time we're going to be using it. Mold soap is going to make many, many appearances throughout this episode because you have got to make sure that nothing sticks to that plaster. Okay, it is happening. We are going to start making some clay walls. I am cutting up slabs of a very inexpensive water-based clay, and I'm going to just start laying it down onto the mold chair. The mold chair is going to support things, and it's going to keep things nice and square. Now, the trick is you just want to pack this clay in as tightly as you can. Plaster, just like dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, will find a way to leak if you leave any voids or cavities as you're setting up these walls. So I'm just really making sure I'm filling all my voids, and the other thing I'm absolutely making sure I'm not doing is nicking or bumping the master sculpture. You want to keep that sculpture nice and clear. Here I'm making the sprue. That's the sprue. You can just have extended it. That's where the slip will be entering the mold. And now I'm making the last part. That's going to be the small kind of plug piece of the 4-piece mold that we're making. Once I've got it all kind of blocked out, I go through with a kidney and some water and just get things really smooth and nice. Not perfectly smooth, but pretty darn smooth. Okay, I think that we've got it. Is it perfect? No, but I will be fixing a lot of the little imperfections you see in the plaster. I find it's easier to fix it in the plaster than it is to fix it in the clay. Everybody, with me, cross those fingers. We do not want a hashtag plaster disaster. In fact, let's cross both fingers. Let's cross every finger we can cross, because we do not want any, oh God, we do not want any plaster disasters. I use C-clamps to hold the cottle boards together, and I really crank them down because this plaster is heavy and it's going to really push on the walls. Then I lay down little snakes of clay and fill in every little gap in just any space the plaster might find its way through. The most difficult part of this is making sure that little flecks of dried clay from my hands don't fall onto the sculpture or the perfect little, mold walls that I've set up. It kind of can be really annoying to pick those little crumbs out. Then I just check my plaster ratios and I measure out my plaster, and we get ready to pour. If you're wondering how I mix and what ratios I use, there's a fantastic book that I cannot recommend enough. I'll put a link to it in the description for this video. Okay, now we are going to watch this like a hawk for leaking. So I'm looking along the seams here. I'm looking around the bottom edges. I'm watching the level of the plaster itself. If it suddenly starts to sink on one corner or one area, I know that plaster has found its way into some cavity and is leaking underneath the model somehow. So far, oh my God, things are looking okay. But I'm just gonna keep an eye on this for another 5 minutes or so. That plaster went pretty well. It was a big batch and it started to it was a little thicker than I would have liked. So I'm hoping I didn't trap a bubble. I hope I didn't. I really vibrated the table. We'll see. We'll work with whatever we have. We can make it work. It isn't a disaster just yet. And that's what I want to focus on. That nothing is blowing out, or I don't want to speak too soon. No, it looks good. It looks good. So we're gonna let this thing set, and then tomorrow we're gonna come back and we just might pour all 3 remaining pieces in one day. it goes a lot faster after this first ultra stressful section. Okay, it's been about, 20 minutes or so, and I don't know if you can see, there's like a dull sheen on the surface of the plaster. That means it is starting the chemical reaction, and it is no longer in a fluid state. It's more like, kind of like peanut butter. So I'm not worried anymore about this thing, bursting open and spilling all over the studio floor. And that means that it is time for me to enjoy my Friday. I think it's time to go for a run and then follow that with a fine adult beverage. See you tomorrow for the rest of this mold. All right. It has set up completely. It is a brand new day. We are going to take these walls off and flip this over to do the other side. Okay, before I can flip this mold over, we've got to take apart a little bit of the mold chair. We're going to be doing this side here next, and you can see there's this piece of wood here. We got to get rid of this piece of wood. So the mold chair has been specially designed to come apart in stages, just like a rocket going to the moon, and we got to take this piece off right now. I don't know if that was a good analogy, but we're just going to go with it. After taking off the first stage of the mold chair, we flip the mold over and then we carefully pull away the clay that we used to build up the first wall. Now, I'm not going to take all of it away. We're going to leave a little bit of clay to act as the sprue, and we're also going to sculpt the other half of what will be part 3, the little plug that's going to go behind the bird's skull. I'm taking extra care to not, bump or nudge the original clay sculpture. We don't want to hurt it, and I'm following that little pen line that we put on earlier so I know exactly where to put the parting line. So this is the time when I go in and I fix the imperfections in the plaster. Remember I talked about I'm not too worried about getting like a perfect surface because I can go back and fix it in the plaster and that it's easier. So you'll see there are tiny bumps and nicks in the surface, and I'm going to go over and scrape it back with a metal kidney. I'll either use this one or this one. I love this one as well. And I'm just going to refine that surface and get it nice and smooth and perfect. And then we will add some keys, we will release it, and we will pour the next piece. Now I'm going to be extra careful to not bump the sculpture, especially since we're using basically these sharp knives. That's what these little kidneys are. They're little thin strips of steel, so you do not want to knock the sculpture while you're cleaning up the plaster. Okay, is all of this level of attention and detail necessary? Not really, but I think of it as it's an investment in my future. It is an investment in future me, because the cleaner and better and more time I put into the mold now, the less time I'm going to have to wrestle with it when I'm casting in the future. You are investing in your future by putting more time into your mold now. There is nothing worse than seeing a mistake in the mold and saying, I'll fix it later, because you're going to have to fix that little mistake on every single one of your castings. And believe me, that gets really tedious when you're doing editions of like 150 or 250 mugs. That is a lot of times for you to look at that same mistake and go, wow, I really wish I fixed that in the mold. So put the time in now. Can a mold that is yuckier than this or chunkier than this still cast? Of course. And please, this is not the only way to make molds. This is the way that I make molds. It works for me. This isn't the end-all, be-all way that you have to do it. I just thought you'd like to see the way that I do it. Okay, we're going to put in some keys really quick. Keys are the ways that the two halves of the mold register together. I'm going to be using these giant router bits. I have a 1-inch sphere and a 2-inch, I guess it's a half sphere. I'm going to be doing a couple of these giant ones and then a couple of these little ones. I have found that the way to do these is to just go very slowly and do your best to not mess up your sculpture while you're working on it. Alrighty, we've got the keys in, we got the clay cleaned up. It looks messy, but I did clean it up. And we are ready for the most critical step before we pour plaster, and that is putting a release agent on this first piece. Plaster sticks to plaster like super glue. So we've got to put a barrier between this piece and the next piece we pour. And for that, we will be using mold soap. Several coats of mold soap, like 3 good coats. Same drill as before with the mold soap. We are going to brush on a good layer of it, and then I go back with a rag and a dry brush and remove any extra mold soap, and I want to really buff in the mold soap. Once you get it a few coats on there, you're going to feel it. It's really smooth and shiny. It makes the plaster kind of look like glass. That's how you know you're getting a number of coats and a good release, and that the subsequent, oh my God, I messed that word up. The next piece of plaster you pour will not stick to this. Alrighty, I think we are ready to pour piece number 2. I have sealed up all the cracks and edges on this with a little bead of clay in the hopes that it doesn't leak. And just like we did in the last piece, I'd like you all to collectively cross every finger that you can in the hopes that we avoid a hashtag plaster disaster. Okay, I'm really trying to stay calm here. Really just focusing. So you just want to pour slowly and evenly. Let that plaster find its way over the surface of the model. The bucket is very heavy and it's tricky to just have that steady, even flow, so I'm really focusing on that also. Of course, I'm looking for leaks at all times. The more plaster that goes into the mold, the more pressure against the edges of the mold, the more pressure against the walls, the more pressure against any cracks and gaps, and that is scary. Oh my God, okay, now we're just gonna watch this thing. There is a lot of weight pushing down on any crack and seam in here. This plaster has a lot of mass. Oh. Okay, I've been watching it for a while. The level is not dropping. So I think it's safe for me to go and eat a tuna fish sandwich for lunch. We'll be back after lunch to pour the next 2 pieces. Back from lunch, and plaster is nice, firm, and toasty. Because we use so much mold soap, the cottle boards pop right off with no trouble, and I quickly scrape smooth and flat the top surface of the plaster mold. Okay, so we are going to pour the next piece, but first we have to remove this clay. So this is going to be a very fast piece to pour because we don't have to make any walls. The little wooden base is going to act as one of the walls, and then these 2 other pieces that we poured are the other walls. So we're just going to have to pull this clay out, clean it up, maybe put a little release in there on the new plaster pieces, and then pour it in. Of all the times you're removing clay, this is the scariest when it comes to bumping into the original sculpture because we can't see it. So I'm just really carefully pulling clay out and taking care not to knock the sculpture. Okay, here we go. So this is what I mean about it goes faster the more pieces you pour. So I mean, it took us like the better part of a day to pour the first piece, and then we got the second piece poured this morning. This third piece, it's only 20 minutes after lunch, and we're about to pour it. And best of all, this piece is the least likely to leak. Ta-da! Okay, we are in the home stretch. Piece number 1, 2, 3 has just finished setting. It's still warm to the touch, but it's cool for me to take all this apart. And we are about to embark on the very last part of this mold, part 4. Now, of course, this isn't the end of the mold journey. This is going to be the end of this plaster mold section of the mold journey. In order to do that, we're going to clean up this top, we're going to take this base off, and we're going to put up some new walls. And I think they're going to use the magic of time lapse to make that go by quickly. Yeah, this section's a little tricky. Yeah, Okay, so I'm just about ready to pour this bottom section, and I went and I put a little line here, and this line is to let me know how thick of the plaster I want to pour. I don't want to fill this entire thing up with plaster. That's way too thick of a piece. I only want this piece to be about 1.5 inches thick, so that is why that little line is there. It's good to remember that because once the plaster goes in, it's almost impossible to figure out how deep it was unless you stick a stick in it, but that's kind of hard to do while you're pouring plaster, so trying to stay ahead of the game. Okay, I am set to pour the final piece, piece 4 of this mold. And as you can see, it is the most precarious of the pieces. To get my cottle boards around the very top last section, I had to lift them up off of the table surface. So there is an extra danger of plaster pouring out. So we are all, for the final time in the plaster portion of this mold making adventure, going to cross our fingers. I'm going to mix up a final batch of plaster and pour it in here. And holy moly, I hope it doesn't blow up all over my floor. Okay, that was it. That was the last one. Oh my God, I don't want this to leak. It looks like we are in the clear. It's been about 15 minutes. Nothing horrible has happened. So I am going to exit the studio, have some celebratory pizza, perhaps a adult beverage. Who can say? And I will pop back in here tomorrow where we will try to pop this open. And then if all is good, we will make a mold of this mold. Okay, it is a very rainy Sunday, and I'm heading to the studio. I have started a kiln, believe it or not, and I am doing it to warm up the mold. So we've got all those parts poured, and I want to crack the mold open today. Hang on, we're going to switch camera angles. Okay, so we've got the mold. We set this all up yesterday. It is set, it is looking good, and I want to pop it open, but the issue is the monster clay is the hard variety, if you recall. And my concern is that when I pop open the mold, it might resist or chip some delicate areas of the plaster because the hard clay is hard, and this plaster, after sitting in the studio overnight, is ice cold. And as we know, the monster clay is wax-based, so the colder it gets, the more firm it gets, the warmer it gets, the softer it gets. So I'm going to take this plaster mold, put it next to the kiln that is warming up, and let it sit there for a couple hours so that the clay inside softens up. Okay, so that is gonna sit in there. I'm gonna check on it for the next few hours while it slowly warms up. It's on a fast glaze firing, so it's gonna heat up really quick. And in the meantime, I'm going to head back to the house and edit the Tiki Technical Tuesday about sculpting this mug. Okay, the mold has been sitting by the kiln for many hours. It is warm to the touch, and we are hoping that the clay is somewhat softer inside, and we're gonna try to pop it open. To pop it open, we'll be using these. They are some form of automotive tool. I believe that they are possibly split ring pliers. I don't know. I will put a link to these in the description for the video because everyone always asks me about them. But my molds all have little pry points built into them where I can stick these in and pop open the mold. If all goes well, let's go get it and see what happens. I'm going to start with the smallest piece first. Oh. Okay. Oh. Well, that went pretty easy. Fantastic. That is an epic sigh of relief. Once we got the pieces apart, it's time to clean out all of the extra mold soap, clay residue, anything that you don't want to be captured in the silicone, and get these things ready for the next big step. Okie dokie, we have beveled and sanded and rounded all of the corners of the mold. Why do we do that? Well, for one, let's be honest, it looks very pretty, but it also makes it easy to find the parting edges of the molds when we open them, and perhaps most importantly, a rounded edge or a beveled edge is let's do that all again. A rounded edge or a beveled edge is much less likely to chip. We do not want chipped plaster getting into our Slipcast mugs because plaster in the kiln tends to blow up and ruin things. So we've got the things looking great, and you might be wondering, can we just start making a mug now? Well, yes and no. We could let this mold dry out completely and use it to cast right away, but we need to consider mold math. First things first, if you've got just one mold, if that mold should happen to break, like you drop it on the floor, you are out of luck. You just got to go back and remake the whole mold over again. Then you need to consider how many castings you can get in a day. Because of the way slip casting works, you can get one cast out of a mold in one day. That means in a week, 5 work days, you can have 5 mugs cast. If you're looking to do an addition of 200 mugs, that's going to take you 40 weeks. Now, if you've got 10 molds in a day, you can make 10 castings. That means in 1 week, with 10 molds working 5 work days a week, you'll end up with a total of 50 mugs. That means if we were doing an addition of 200, we could hit that goal in just 4 weeks. In addition to all of that math, you have to think about longevity. These molds don't last forever. In fact, I can usually get about 20 to 25 castings out of a mold before the surface starts to degrade to the point where I think it affects the casting. So it's always nice to be able to make more than just one mold. So if the mold math tells us that we need more molds and the mold longevity says it's a good idea to have more molds, how do we get more molds? It's simple. We make a flexible silicone mold of our plaster mold, and that is what I'm gonna do right now. Whoa. We are like a half hour into this thing. We do not have time to start mixing up some silicone rubber in this episode. So join me in the next episode where we dive into a big bucket of silicone. See you then.